Hey, welcome to another episode of Lessons on Learning. Short, quick-fire videos, about 15 minutes or less, where we're just going to be able to talk about how people learn and how to create the best learning experiences for your students when you're delivering your training and education. In this video, we're going to be covering part one of different types of practices, how we practice for our learners. Choosing the right kind of practice is super important because not all practice is the same. So in this video, we're going to look at two particular types of practice, and then we have a part two video later on. You'll be able to find on the channel somewhere where we talk about another two types of practice and how they interlink with each other as well. So let's get started straight away. Contrary to popular belief, practice is not just practice. In fact, there's a really important thing to consider when it comes to practicing, and it's this: a little bit of forgetting helps us remember. I know that sounds a bit counterintuitive, but there it is. A little bit of forgetting helps us remember. The most common form of practice really is where we just decide on a task, we teach it to a learner, and then we set aside a bunch of time and we really drill that learner on this particular task, and they go over it and over it and over it again, relying on the method of repetition to try and master that task. Well, repetition is really good. There is that saying, isn't there, that repetition is the mother of all mastery. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that, really. I think repetition is the mother of all muscle memory, but I'm not sure that muscle memory and mastery are the same things. So look, if you've got a particular task that you want to teach to somebody, and it's really important that they learn that task precisely the way that you teach it, if it's also equally important that they get to that point quickly as possible, and then the traditional forms of practice usually work quite well. So let's have a look at what that is, this traditional form of practice, if you like. It's what's commonly referred to as blocked practice, and it's where we literally block out a space of time, however much time that is, and we drill our learner. Okay, so this is the task that we have to do today, so do this and do this for the next 6 weeks, 5 days a week, 3 hours a day, and just go at this, and it's a skills drill. That's what it is, a skills drill. And again, it's fantastic if we're working on relatively mundane or relatively repetitive tasks. So if it's a fairly simple task where it's pretty routine, it's the same thing over and over again, I don't know, folding a box or going through a particular procedure or making a coffee or whatever it is, if it's very, very standardized, then blocked practice works really well. Blocked practice works really well in production line settings, in kind of factory type production. I don't know for sure, but I guess block practice works well in the sort of the mass franchise coffee shops or the mass fast food places where you have to produce exactly the same result in so many steps, in so much time, and it has to be super consistent. Then blocked practice works really well. Drill down, go at it until you've got it. So the big advantage is when you want a very specific, tight result, and you want it in the shortest amount of time possible. Block practice works really well. The downside to block practice, unfortunately, is that again, it's very mundane. It is really about drilling down. And so for our learner, it can easily become a little bit of a chore and perhaps less engaging. Also as well, going over and over things like this time and time again, it can be a lot of data coming into somebody's head, and sometimes not giving them time to process that data or step back and have a little breathing space. Well, working memory can only handle so much. The cup gets full and starts to overflow, and it actually becomes counterproductive. So something else that can equally work is, instead of doing everything in blocks, is to think about spacing it out. So practice for a couple of days and then have a break. and then practice for another couple of days, and then have a break. And sometimes the break needs to be at least as long, if not longer, than the practice session was. So if you practice something for a day, you need to take at least a day not practicing. So think of this in the same way that an athlete might train for a day, but the recovery day, where they're not doing any kind of training, is just as important as the training day, as the track practice. It's the same with this type of practice. And this type of practice is what we call spaced practice. And we call it that because the time that we practice is spaced out. So this is really advantageous for two reasons. Reason number one, it's a little easier on the student because it gives them those rest days, that downtime, where they're not drilled so much, where they can go off and have a little playtime and do something that they want to do rather than they feel they have to do. In other words, it stops the practice from turning into a chore. But neurologically speaking, as far as the sort of synaptic connections and the neurons in our brain goes, actually creating spaces between the practice allows the learner to forget a little. Now, I know this sounds counterproductive, counterintuitive. They shouldn't really be forgetting anything. But if we can then build in time at the next practice session to ask them questions, maybe create some exercises, stimulate some discussion, and help them to work at remembering, the more they work at remembering, the more effort they put into remembering, the stronger those recollections and memories become. So giving a learner an amount of space in order to forget a little, and then purposely working to help them recall that information, will really help to strengthen the connections that they've made during the practice. And so each piece of practice that they do, it suffers a small amount of degradation right at the very beginning, but then quickly climbs. And that amount of degradation gets less and less over time, and the speed at which the skill resumes and climbs gets faster and faster over time. So in actual fact, in the short term, spaced practice might take longer, but the effects go deeper and the effects themselves last longer. I'm sorry, I've got notifications coming out all over the place. I should really turn those off. But anyway, think about it that way. It really all depends on what you're wanting to create. If you're wanting a really hardcore, drill down exercise and there's very little room for maneuver, no room for variation, you want a very tight, specific task and you want it doing in a short space of time, blocked practice is going to work. But if it's a task that's somewhat creative, somewhat variable, if there's little sort of caveats and tangents, if you want a little bit more depth in what it is that you're doing and you have the time, space practice can be really efficient in slightly more creative and complex tasks. So, hope that helps, my friends. If you've enjoyed this video, watch out for the second video. This is kind of practice, different types of practice part 2. It'll be on the channel, but drop a comment, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, tell your friends, and I'll see you on another episode of Lessons on Learning. Take care, my friends. Bye-bye.